alcohol doesn't bring out the best in people's characters. Alcohol almost universally makes people less than they are. It's fun because it eradicates your concern for future consequences. It actually kind of does that physiologically, you might say, because alcohol is a potent anxiety-reducing drug. For some people, it's also a psychomotor stimulant like cocaine, and it was certainly that for me. And for for people too, it can have a heroin-like effect, which facilitates the sense of social belonging. And I think I had all three of those effects from alcohol. So I liked it quite a lot. But the consequence for me was, I would misbehave when I was drinking in ways that made me remorseful the next day or the next 2 days or the next week. And I realized at that point that was a performative contradiction in a sense. Performative contradiction is when you act out something that's a lie, that's runs contrary to your moral beliefs, right? And so I was looking at the literature on atrocity, trying to determine how the proclivity to bring those states about, those hellish states about, might be ameliorated. Like, what's the opposite of evil? That's the question I suppose I was trying to solve. And so when I saw patterns of behavior in my own life that were making things worse than they had to be, then that was an indication that it was time to stop. And I moved to Montreal after that to go to graduate school, and that was a pretty dramatic transformation in my social milieu. And I started to drop a lot of the things that I was doing that were counterproductive. Took me another 4 years, something like that, to just stop drinking altogether, stop smoking, to exercise more, to be more disciplined.
Did you find that difficult? Did you find that difficult to do?
Oh, yes. Of course. Yeah. I was very good at drinking.
Good at it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose, I was very social. I had a large group of friends. I had a blast.
I had an interesting experience with alcohol, which was I had made the personal decision to completely abstain from it. I was disgusted by it for a really long time, up until being about 21 and a half. And I went to a party school. Everyone claims it's a party school. This one, there was a lot of drinking, obviously. And then I finally made the decision after I had realized, it's funny. I just remember this right now. Okay. I wrestled with the decision to drink because I just thought it made everything worse. Obviously, I thought you're poisoning and polluting yourself. I thought that it's hurting your relationship with spirituality, everything. And I remember after all this debate, I went and read your opinion on alcohol. And it actually allowed me, it gave myself permission to drink, which I know sounds exactly the opposite of what you're saying. Mm-hmm. But you had said it was really only a sin or bad if you do it in excess. Mm-hmm. So I finally allowed myself to drink.
Yeah, I didn't like to do it except in excess. So
yeah, well, I soon later found out that that is pretty nice on occasion. Not a recommendation, but I found your opinion on that, and this was after about 1.5 years of honestly, I was suffering a lot. So I was in my head, I was anxious, I couldn't be myself. I felt like I was disassociating in environments, but actually, I drank alcohol, and it brought me into the present for the first time in a very long time. And I think, oddly enough, that was a part of healing, which sounds completely counterproductive and not intuitive at all, but it helped me, oddly enough.
It's like training wheels,
to experience, a social environment physically, you're actually there to experience happiness for the first time in a very long time. I did it with a close friend of mine, but I don't know if that means anything, if there's any significance to that, or, I don't want to be recommending alcohol.
The significance fundamentally is that things are complicated. Lots of teenagers now don't drink at all. So you might say, well, that's a good thing because alcohol, all things considered, is problematic. But if you're not partying because you have no friends and you're in your basement miserable and depressed, that's not an improvement. No, and so I suppose to some degree, whether or not something is good depends on your starting point. I can understand, for example, why so many young men admire Andrew Tate. At least Andrew Tate has all the positive aspects of a successful narcissist. It beats the hell out of being depressed and anxious. Now, is that a stellar goal? No, but it's an improvement over isolated misery. You see this in female mate choice. There's a strong proclivity in women to be enamored of bad boys. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But one reason is, well, they're a hell of a lot more interesting than martyred, miserable, depressed, anxious, self-conscious, low self-esteem non-starters. So now, is that an optimal choice? No. But comparatively, that's the attraction of the shadow figure fundamentally. What did Nietzsche say about morality? Most morality is cowardice. What did he mean by that? Well, he didn't mean that morality was cowardice. He said most morality is cowardice. And what he meant by that was people find themselves too timid to do anything. And so instead of admitting their lack of courage to themselves, they put a moral gloss on it and say that the reason they're timorous is because they're good. That's a form of moral hypocrisy. There were kids in my high school, for example, who never drank. They were good kids, but they weren't good. They're just cowards. That wasn't helpful. Now, my delinquent friends in junior high and high school, a lot of them became alcoholics. So their lack of cowardice on the exploration front also caused them a tremendous amount of misery. Look, there's actually a literature on this. So imagine you took adolescents and on a distribution of rule breaking. Okay. There's kids who never break any rules on one end, and there's kids who break them all the time on the other end. And then there's the kids in the middle who experiment with rule breaking in adolescence. Well, the ones who never break rules are at much higher risk for depression, anxiety, and dependent personality disorder later in life. They're too inhibited. And the ones who break rules all the time, well, they end up in prison. So you want to have that. I'm not saying that you should be in the middle exactly. I'm saying that there's a optimal mode of being that allows you to explore, even in ways that could potentially be destructive, and that's the best pathway to facilitate development.
It's like 12 rules. It's the order and chaos. It's walking the line between what's familiar and known versus exploring something.
Because you don't want to make the error of presuming that a totalitarian order is equivalent to morality.
It's funny, what you said was actually exactly the conclusion that I had came to, which was I was assigning a false sense of morality to myself because I was sober. Even though it just made me feel good about myself. Because I thought that I was, holier than thou.
Yeah, right.
Because I wasn't drinking and I was denying myself that because other people would say that, like people that cared about me, but I wouldn't actually accept it. And it was out of cowardice.
It's interesting how alcohol affects everybody differently, because for me, it puts me to sleep. I'll have 2 drinks and instantly I'm just like, all right, I'm tired. This isn't fun. I'm not enjoying myself.
So
for some people, it's an accelerant.
Stimulant effect.
No, it's
same here.
We tested people in the lab in Montreal. You give them 3 drinks in 20 minutes, so a pretty decent dose. Their heart rate would go up 40 beats per minute. It was just like a shot of cocaine. And those were often people who had a history of familial alcoholism, so they had a genetic predisposition to be alcoholic, but they were getting a psychomotor stimulant kick. And it looks like that was opiate mediated. So for some people, when they drink, they produce a lot of beta endorphin, which is an opiate. It's in the opiate family. And so there's endless benefit to that. I had a friend in Montreal, an old guy, Frank Irvin. He was a cool old guy, looked like Ernest Hemingway. I liked Frank a lot. He had a monkey farm on St. Kitts, vervet monkeys, and him and his wife, Roberta Palmer, who was also very cool. They ran an alcohol lab for years, and they gave these vervet monkeys free access to rum and coke, and 5% of them would drink Tacoma on first exposure. It was funny. They had videos of that, and it's like a frat party. It's very funny to watch these drunk monkeys, but 95% of them wouldn't drink Tacoma, right? They'd have a bit and stop, but 5% of them would. It was like, where have you been all my life? Like Barney Gumble on The Simpsons, So alcohol is a great drug for some people. It wasn't for you.
Yeah.
It's just a natural disposition to either being accelerated while you're taking alcohol or being, I guess, slowed down.
If you're very fortunate, let's say, and you really want to become an alcoholic, it would be good to be susceptible to the anxiety reduction element and the psychomotor stimulant element and the opiate element. And then, hooray, it's a very good drug, except it makes you stupid. That's also the part of the problem with being hedonistically oriented. It's short-term gratification. It's like, well, that's fine, but what do you pay for?
Yeah.
You know?
That was one of the reasons too why I completely stopped drinking, is because the more successful I got, the bigger the price I had to pay. Like taking half a day off became so valuable that I thought to myself, do I want to pass that up for 2 drinks?
Yeah.
Or would I rather just not have the 2?
Well, that was another thing that also convinced me to stop drinking is when I was working on my first book, I couldn't, first of all, it was too emotionally demanding to work on when I was hungover. Like I just couldn't handle it. It was just too much because, you know, reading about sadistic Auschwitz guards is rather disturbing at the best of times. And if you're royally hungover, it's much worse. And also I couldn't edit because I couldn't think clearly. And, you know, one of the things, so here's something to consider. So in the biblical stories of transformation, Abraham, the story of Abraham's a good example of that. So Abraham leaves the confines of his family. He's from a wealthy family. He leaves the comfort and the confines of his family. He goes out into the world. God comes to him as the spirit of adventure. And then Abraham goes through a series of transformations of personality. His name is actually Abram to begin with, Abram. He's renamed about 2/3 of the way through the story. And the reason for that is that his identity transforms so radically that it's as if he's a new person. Okay, so what does he do? Well, he starts aiming up, and then his personality transforms. He has to make a sacrifice. So he builds an altar and he makes a sacrifice. Well, what's the sacrifice? Well, you just said what the sacrifice is. You jumped up a rung in terms of the field of opportunity and responsibility that was in front of you, and you thought, oh, my time's too valuable to waste half a day. Well, that also happened to me in graduate school. It's like, no, I can't afford this anymore.
Yeah.
And it's not even I couldn't afford it. It's like, I have something better to do. This is something that anybody who's watching and listening, for example, if you want to deal with an addiction, it's one thing to quit. Quitting doesn't exactly work. You have to replace it with something better. And if alcohol's great or if cocaine's great for you, it's like, well, what could be better? Well, that's your problem fundamentally. But, you know, you said, well, you discovered that your time was valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's better I certainly came to that conclusion in graduate school. It's like, no, what I'm working on is so interesting that I don't want to compromise it even a little bit. You know, and so imagine that you move up these rungs, that's Jacob's ladder, by the way, up these rungs of transformation. With every major transition, there's going to be a sacrifice.
Yeah, I think over time, too, that's why it became more disagreeable. It's just because your time is so valuable that you know what you need to focus on, and you tend to put down other things.
Yes, definitely. That's a matter. Sure. That's one of the advantages actually to being disagreeable is that you can prioritize more stringently.
Right.
And, you know, that as a virtue, that's got a bad rap in our culture because you're supposed to be agreeable all the time. You're not supposed to discriminate. You're not supposed to judge. It's like, really? You're not supposed to discriminate. So everything's the same, is it? That's how you're going to organize your life. There's nothing that distinguishes that from utter chaos. You have to be unbelievably discriminating. That's the logos, right? So when God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise, or when they actually fall out of paradise because of their pride, which is a more accurate way of representing it, God installs a cherubim, which is a kind of a monstrous angel, and a sword that's on fire that turns every which way. And what does that mean? Well, it means that a sword obviously cuts, and a flaming sword burns. And so a flaming sword cuts and burns. And if it turns every which way, there's no escaping it. Well, why? Well, if you want to regain paradise, then everything that isn't appropriate has to be cut and burned away. And that can be a lot. So people are terrified of that. Like I've read metaphysical speculations that hell, there's no difference between hell for the sinful and the sight of the sword that cuts and burns everything away. Because if you're 95% lies, then anything that fixes you would look like death or worse. And so the terrifying ideal that destroys everything about you that's not worthy, that's rough. Well, you know, you experience that at least to some degree with regards to your conclusions about drinking.
Yeah.
And this is the case, like so I never drink now. So what happened to me is I quit when I was about 27. It took me a while. And then I quit till I was about 50. And part of the reason I quit too was because I was having kids and there was no way I was going to be drunk around my kids. Like, no, that wasn't going to happen. And then my kids left and I was 50 and I thought, well, maybe I could have a drink or two and see, because it's kind of a pain to in a way, socially, to never have a glass of wine. Now I don't care. But then, there was still some awkwardness about that. And I don't know, some curiosity. So I drank a bit when I was around 50, and I thought I was just stupid at 50 as I was when I was 27. I'd have 2 or 3 drinks, and then it was, all right, man, we're off to the races, and so I just stopped again. And now, now there's just no question about it, because I can't afford ever to make a mistake.
Yeah.
So